everybody finds. Yes, it is. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming this evening. I'm going to stream this for our friends on Facebook. Please bear with me. Thank you all so much for joining us. Almost finished. Oh, it's buffering. Here we go. Let's see. Thanks, gang. All right. See some familiar faces or names, I suppose. All right, so we are streaming on Facebook, so we can get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Caitlin. I'm the events coordinator here at Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi. We're here this evening with Susan Orlean and Nathaniel Rich to talk about animals. A wonderful collection of essays on animals by Susan Orlean. But before I pass it off to them, I'd love to tell you about a few upcoming events that we have at the bookstore, both virtual and in person. I'll try to keep it brief so we can get on to the main event. So tomorrow, that's Wednesday, October 20th, 6 o'clock Central Time, back on Zoom. We are going to welcome back University of Mississippi MFA alum Julian Randall. He is going to be in conversation with Ariel Marie to discuss her dazzling debut poetry collection, Gumbo Yaya. It's the winner of the 2020 Cave Canem Prize and described as a cauldron of hearty poems exploring race, gender, desire, and violence in the lives of Black girls soaring against the backdrop of a contemporary South. This event is free to attend, but registration is required. You can find out more details on our website. Then Thursday, this one's for our locals, 6 p.m. at the Open Air Old Armory Pavilion. Thacker Mountain Radio is back for another week. This week, we have very special guests. We'll be featuring the man, the myth, the legend, our pal, the old school blues and R&B powerhouse, Bobby Rush, for his memoir, I Ain't Studdin' Ya, My American Blues Story. Bobby's going to be pulling double duty and performing as a musical guest as well. He'll be joined by songwriter Caleb Garrett and our house band, the Yalla Bushwhackers. You can visit our website for links to listen to remotely. And if you can't make it, you can also purchase a signed or personalized copy by visiting squarebooks.com or giving us a call. Last one. So this one's next week. We'll gather back on Zoom Tuesday, October 26th at 6 p.m. Central Time to celebrate a wonderful debut by Jean Kwok. It's called Go Home, Ricky. It's a fresh satirical novel about masculinity and tenderness, fatherhood and motherhood, all set in the world of semi-professional wrestling. He'll be joined in conversation by novelist and Square Books alum, Michael Bible. And I think all sorts of readers will enjoy this discussion, but it is a must not miss for our Barry Hannah fans. All right, enough about them. Let's talk about On Animals, an essay collection celebrating the meaningful cross-species connections that grace our collective existence. Susan Orlean has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1992. She is the New York Times bestselling author of 7 books, including The Library Book, Rin Tin Tin, Saturday Night, and The Orchid Thief, which was made into an Academy Award-winning film adaptation. She lives with her family and her animals in sunny Los Angeles and may be reached at susanorlean.com and on Twitter at Susan Orlean. She's joined on the Zoom screen by our pal Nathaniel Rich. He's the author of Losing Earth and the novels King Zeno and Odds Against Tomorrow. His book of essays on environmental themes, Second to Nature, was published in March 2021. Thank you both so much for spending the time to do this and talk about this wonderful book. I'm going to get out of here, but those of y'all tuning in at home, please submit questions in the Q&A and I will come back and moderate those towards the end. All right, thank you both so much again and have fun.
Thank you. Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, Susan, for having this conversation. It's really a thrill to speak with you. I've been looking forward to the conversation, and I thought it might be nice to begin by you reading a passage from On Animals to give us a sense of the voice and the subject.
Well, Thank you, Nathaniel, for doing this, and thanks to Square Books and all the independent booksellers who are out there every day supporting writers. So thank you for having me here. So this is from the introduction to the book. The art critic and philosopher John Berger once said that we like to look at animals because they remind us of the past, and particularly of the agrarian life we used to lead that included the regular presence of animals. I agree, but I also think we look at animals because they're funny and companionable and interesting. Some of my animals have jobs. My chickens lay eggs. My dog scares the FedEx man. The cats, by their arrogant disregard of duty, serve to remind me that I have to schedule Terminex to come and chase the mice out of the basement. All of these creatures serve a purpose, even if that purpose is to have no real purpose other than to give a warm, wonderful, unpredictable texture to my life every day. I wouldn't have it any other way. I've wanted to write about animals as long as I've wanted to have animals. The first book I ever produced was a manuscript written in pencil on a scratch pad, bound with staples, called Herbert the Nearsighted Pigeon. It was the story of a myopic pigeon who has relationship troubles on account of not being able to recognize his friends. I wrote the book when I was 5 years old. I'm not sure I was quite that young, but that's the family legend anyway. After Herbert, I wrote a million horse stories, mostly as an attempt to conjure a horse into my life. When I began writing professionally, I always had a soft spot for stories about animals. These always turned out to be stories about people, as seen through their relationships with animals, as much as they were about animals. Writing the animal part of these stories was challenging. People can be figured out, but animals are enigmatic. So the best we can do is try to understand them through the lens of people living with them, or using them, or raising them, or wanting them.
That's lovely, and I'm reminded now, reading or hearing the passage for the second time, that John Berger also lived on a farm in France, and the reason I know that is I had an old friend who was in one of those farming programs, and she ended up working on his farm without knowing who he was.
God, that's amazing.
I know, it's incredible, and had an incredible. That's a whole other story. But you had a farm yourself, and you write about it in the book and in the Hudson Valley, and you have now sold it and moved to Los Angeles full time. And it occurred to me that might have coincided roughly with your putting together this collection. And I wondered if there was any kind of, I don't know, therapeutic. You write about the loss of the farm and of the animals, and I wondered if somehow the mourning of it took form as the book, or if it was just a way to continue your relationship with the farm, or with all these animals that surrounded you.
Well, they are very much of a piece. I think the book did serve as a bit of solace and reflection on a period of my life where I had the most animals. And it was also, the book and the selling of the farm were both, in a sense, sort of COVID related. I think during COVID, two things happened. One is I, like most of America, got another dog, which seemed to be, besides baking sourdough bread, seemed to be what people were doing during COVID. And secondly, it was a period of time when I was really reflective. And I think a lot of us were sort of taking stock of life, and, in the middle of these dire circumstances. And for me, it was looking back professionally and reflecting on what I've written about and what I've cared about in my career. Similarly, we sold our farm in part because it became very daunting to think about getting there during COVID. And so these all felt very interrelated. It was sort of the moment.
And the stories in the collection, do you refer to them as stories? Actually, I'm curious, or essays, or?
It's funny because people refer to them as essays, and I always think, oh, it's not really an essay, at least by my understanding of an essay. I mean, they're reported pieces. The beginning section of the book and the last section of the book are sort of journals, essentially, about my life with animals, and everything in between is a reported story, which I never think of as an essay. I think of an essay as much more of a think piece, as we used to call them. God knows you hope there's a lot of thinking that you do in these reported pieces, but to me, they're pieces. They're pieces of journalism.
Yeah. But I think I wonder if, as you were going back over your career, or a large chunk of it, and looking back at these stories, I imagine some. I was curious which ones are the ones that have stayed with you. That I imagine some you probably forgot about or weren't as fresh, and others, I imagine, must be something ones that you think about all the time. And I'm curious what those are.
I thought a lot about. Over the years, I've sort of followed the story of Keiko, the orca who starred in the Free Willy movies, because it was such a saga, and it was such a complicated, nuanced story. And so I've sort of thought about it over the years, because it was a piece of pop culture as well. So it's sort of in the air in a different way than some of these other stories, which are more specific to something that I uncovered or that I pursued that wasn't part of, everybody knows the movie Free Willy. So it kind of remains as an active sort of topic of pop culture, the ways a lot of these other stories have not. Similarly, the story that I wrote about this woman in suburban New Jersey who had 27 tigers as pets. I've thought about that story over the years frequently because it was such a crazy story. And then when Tiger King became this phenomenon, I thought, oh my God, this is, really it's the same story that I didn't watch Tiger King because I found the subject so disturbing, really. After having done that story. So I thought about it a lot in the context of people talking about Tiger King.
Well, and that story also, it's funny because we're probably the two people in this country who haven't seen Tiger King. And when I was reading the New Jersey story, it sent me to the internet to say, wait, is this the Tiger King story? But it also reminded me of this other horrible but sort of grimly fascinating story that I saw you did write about briefly, the Zanesville story of this similar thing. They had this exotic wildlife in the middle of Ohio who escaped and started rampaging through this town. I wondered if you were tempted. That seemed in your lane, but I guess that was more. There wasn't much charming about that.
It was such a horrible story. And in fact, if I'm remembering correctly, the guy who owned these animals actually turned them loose and intentionally let them go. Right. And, the subject of people keeping exotic animals is one that is so deeply disturbing. The story of the woman in New Jersey I was really drawn to it because it was the first time I'd ever heard about something so extraordinary, that she was living in suburban New Jersey with 27 tigers in her yard, and denying that a tiger that was found wandering through the middle of the town was her tiger.
Right. She wasn't even sure if she'd lost one. Yeah.
Right. I mean, she didn't know exactly how many tigers she had, so, which is a bad sign. And, partly I came away from reporting that story really disturbed by the idea of people keeping exotic animals who should not be keeping exotic animals. So when I heard about the Zanesville event, I was tugged toward writing about it. And then I thought, I don't know if I can do this again, because it's pretty grim. I mean, it's thoroughly grim, I should say. And in the case of this guy in Zanesville, again, I may be misremembering, but I believe that he let the animals loose, and then they all had to be shot by police because they were wandering around Zanesville, Ohio. And you can't have a lion walking through Zanesville, Ohio. I mean, it's problematic.
They were ordered, they were even ordered to be shot, which, as you wrote in your comment, that it actually, though counterintuitively, it might have been the most humane thing to do, given what a disaster the situation had already been. The Free Willy story is really a beautiful story, and one of my favorites as well. And it's an example of something that you do so well, not just in this book, but in your other work. It's a kind of it's like the story. It's like the real Free Willy story of Willy, I guess is the dumb way of saying it. But it's done. It's so much more moving than the Hollywood the Hollywood version, and I think it's also the story where you probably come closest to actually where the protagonist is really the animal. I mean, you write in the section you read, I think was a great way to introduce the book, because indeed, animal stories inevitably, when you're writing about these animals, they inevitably become about the people who take care of them or live with them or love them. But it seems you get closest to at least maybe even representation with Keiko, who really becomes a character. And I'd say the other story that probably comes closest to that is the show dog, Biff. And so I was curious, you clearly had that insight when you're writing the introduction to the essay that introduces the book, that these stories end up being about people. But to what extent, going into writing these stories where the main subject is ostensibly an animal or a group of animals, were you aware of that? Did you always set out to write the Biff story, and then it turned out that people sort of entered in, or from the beginning, is that something that you intended or assumed would ultimately happen?
Well, I mean, Biff was a story where I said to myself, I'm just going to write about the animal. I'm really going to do a profile of this animal. I'm going to write it the way celebrity profiles have been done since the beginning of time, and approach it on those terms. And because he is a celebrity and he lived the life of a supermodel, of, where he had to worry about his looks and was paid to, do sperm deposits. And, well, I'm not sure that human celebrities do that, but he was as, I really wanted to write about him as a being. And of course, it's very hard to do that. It was something where the people around him were fascinating, and actually all of their projection onto him became as fascinating. And I think that I often would enter the story believing that this time it was really going to be about the animal. But, I'm not a naturalist. I'm not a zoologist. I wouldn't go into the wild and track a cougar for a year and then write that story, which would truly be about an animal completely separated from the human world. And that, people do that, certainly, and approach, Jane Goodall, all of these naturalists who really write about animals in that uniquely separate way. And of course, even that is not absolutely separated from the world of humanity. But, it's interesting. One of the great pleasures of the last year for me was watching the film My Octopus Teacher, which I hope everybody has seen. It's an incredible film. And it's very much about the octopus, but so interestingly, it's very much also about the diver and the guy and his own impact on the octopus and what he was seeking in pursuing this octopus. So, we default always to the human story, and that makes sense. It's logical. We have the power of speech. We can draw that dimension out of the people around these animals. And with the exception of wild animals, all of these other animals are in some way dependent on people. So they are very much in the world of human civilization, for better or worse.
Right. I think it's a fascinating tension. You write in the book about being more interested in, domesticated animals. But then, as you point out, there's, depending on your definition of domestication, there's essentially no animals that aren't domesticated in the world. If you expand that to mean, whether we've had some effect on them or their
right.
ecosystems. And so I was, as you're talking about wildness. There's, you talk about it as a misnomer, and I guess you've answered one of my questions, which was, would you ever go, stalk the snow leopard? But the answer is no. But it does seem that there's still a range, and you do seem to be drawn not only to the, certainly domesticated animals, but even animals that are put into human jobs, like literally, there's a fantastic story about Hollywood actor animals. The Biff story, a few of the stories are written in such a way that when they begin, the reader, is under assumes that the character is a human character, only you realize that, this is a mule going to Afghanistan or something. And so I was curious if you could expand a little bit more on that not only, are they sort of domesticated animals, but these are actually, in many cases, they're animals who are either made to do human jobs or do human activities, like have races or contests and things like that.
Right. Well,
why is that? Is it just because it's really funny? Is that the...
Well, it interests me in every story to see, whether they're specifically about animals or not, to see where you have the friction or integration between disparate worlds. I'm just always drawn to that. I'm always curious about what happens when individuals or subcultures that normally wouldn't find themselves together suddenly do. And how do you sort that out? With animals, it's a constant source of curiosity because they are their own world. They are an alternate universe, a parallel universe to ours. And yet we encounter them, overlap with them over and over again. And sometimes in ways that you forget about. You know, it's easy to forget how many animals are even in the most urban setting, that they're, you know, who didn't love Pizza Rat? You know, this meme that of a rat going into the subway in New York, pulling a giant piece of pizza. And, you know, is that more interesting than a rat living in the wild? It's different. It's an animal that has accommodated itself to the human world. And, you know, similarly, people accommodate themselves to the animal world. And that always strikes me as a really interesting place to write about those overlaps that are sometimes not terribly comfortable.
And I'm fading into darkness, so I'm going to quickly remove myself after I ask the next question and turn on a light. But another thing that seems to unite these stories and really unite your whole body of work, I think it's safe to say, is that the characters that you write about, the human characters, you know, it's not just that they're sort of proximate to animals, but they're also obsessive personalities. I mean, so many of my favorite moments are glimpses of these people's lives, like I think of the taxidermists at this taxidermy competition, and you go out to dinner with them, and they're eating ribs, and then at the end of these three guys at the end of the meal are using the ribs to like create little creatures on their plate.
That was
those details are so good, and I feel like you know, do you is it safe to say that that's another theme of yours? I mean, I wonder if that's true of anyone who writes these kinds of
well,
stories.
I am fascinated by obsession. And you know, almost everything that I've written, whether I realized it or not, does often address this question of obsession. And, you know, I sometimes wonder whether that's, well, certainly this was true with The Orchid Thief, that I'm both fascinated by people who are obsessed and sort of envious of them and kind of alienated by them. And I feel like as a journalist that you are sort of required not to be a joiner, that you're meant to be an observer, an objective observer. And so throwing yourself head over heels into some kind of passion feels counterindicated if you're, and particularly being the kind of writer I am, where I kind of flit from subject to subject, and I don't cover a beat. I don't return to a subject over and over again. And some writers do. And they may be just as obsessed as the people they're writing about. I'm quite the opposite. And when I write about something, I almost feel like I never want to write about it again, almost as if it would, I would be losing whatever impartiality or ability to observe if I go back into the same world again.
I really admire that. I mean, that is so rare, and I think there's so many pressures on writers, especially earlier in their career, to find some niche and stay there and become the person on that. And I feel the same way as you. I feel like it's deadening to the writing, and it's just a lot less fun. And I was really I wanted to read this brief quote from an introduction that you wrote a few years ago to a collection called Love and Ruin, edited by Evan Ratliff of Atavist magazine stories, where I feel like you define this kind of writing that you do and that I love so much really well. You say, when I'm asked what kind of writing I do or what kind of writing I like I tend to stumble and faint, avoiding a name altogether. I like interesting stories, I explain, stories that aren't necessarily big news stories, stories that are rich and deep, even if on the surface they seem slight. And I love stories that have been overlooked, that turn out to be windows onto worlds or chapters of history that we never noticed were there. And you go on a little bit, but I feel like that really captures the essence of it, and what makes, so there's something sort of almost counterintuitive about, you're writing about, these are all stories about animals, and yet each one is its own world that you inhabit. And so, as much as I would love to read you on Zanesville or Tiger King, it makes total sense that you wouldn't want to, go there.
Yeah, and it's interesting to put together a thematic collection, and yet the stories are so different. I mean, the profile of a show dog couldn't, and the world that it touches on has nothing in common with the mules that are used by the US Army in Afghanistan. So they're connected thematically, in that they're about this world of animals, and yet each one is a whole subculture. It's an entire universe. And I like having these stories together because it is a kind of journey in a universe, but each one is entirely contained. And yeah, it is sometimes hard then to go back. I mean, people tend to come to you with the same story. If you write about orchids, they come to you to write another story about orchids, or maybe it's about daisies. And, my reaction is, well, no, why would I want to go back to write that? I mean, my expertise is having no expertise. That is, I think I'm really good at not having expertise, about being humble enough that I'm willing to do a story about which I know nothing. And actually, to me, that's the thrill, is learning about something I know nothing about. And I don't mind that it exposes me for not knowing anything about the subject. I mean, that I'm good at being curious, and that feels sufficient to me.
Yeah, it's this thing where the authority comes not from expertise on the subject from I mean, of course you develop an expertise when you're reporting it and doing the research, but the authority is in the writing and in the storytelling, and you don't need to be an academic or whatever you call it, chickenologist.
Chickenologist.
Yeah. I think that's the official term.
Yeah.
I wanted to just encourage people out there to put any questions in the chat, because we can start taking them if anyone's feeling bold. But while people think that over, I wondered if you could read this one quote from Lifelike, which is the story about these taxidermists, because I think it reveals another really wonderful aspect of this collection that we can discuss when you're done. And so this is to be good at taxidermy, I guess.
All right. So this is from Lifelike. To be good at taxidermy, you have to be good at sewing, sculpting, painting, and hairdressing. And mostly you have to be a little bit of a zoology nerd. You have to love animals, love looking at them, taking photographs of them, hunting them, measuring them, casting them in plaster of Paris when they're dead, so that you have a reference when you're, say, attaching ears or lips and want to get the angle and shape exactly right. Some taxidermists raise the animals they most often mount. That way, they can just step out in the backyard when they're trying to remember exactly how a deer looks when it's licking its nose.
I love that, and not just because of that last image, but what struck me reading this story is reading these pieces is that you occupy your perspective, the perspective of the narrator of these stories occupies an interesting middle ground, which is you clearly love animals, but you're not an animal rights crusader. You're not a vegan. You leased your farm for hunting during deer season. A detail I love is you eat turkey for Thanksgiving, but not your turkeys that live
Right.
And the taxidermy story is a great example. It's you're not sort of celebrating the gruesome qualities of it, but you're explaining the attraction. You're explaining why some of it is revolting, and you're telling a story, and you're not you don't have an agenda, and that seems like I don't know, it might seem like a minor thing, but I feel like that's just increasingly rare to find, and that I think most of us live in this sort of middle world of we have opinions about animal rights maybe, but we're maybe not vegan, and we're trying to negotiate a difficult moral terrain, and you encounter these moral issues again and again with animals and captivity, domestication, and so I'm curious, is that what I was going to say is it's a huge range of people, but it's a small range of writers that actually tell those stories, and it feels all the more valuable as a result. And I wondered if you thought in those terms, or if you had a view about writing about, I guess, issues that might be considered controversial, but not yourself having a horse in the race necessarily.
Well, I think
some views about
right. I think that the issue that I hold most dear is the need, the urgency of learning about the world. We live in a universe where people are quick to have opinions and positions, and not so quick to actually learn about what they have an opinion about. For me, there's a moral imperative in learning about the world. And I don't feel that it's necessary for me to feel that hunting is a good or bad thing, to say taxidermy exists, it's fascinating, it's a surprisingly healthy industry, it attracts all sorts of people. Who's doing it and why, and what is the value to them of doing taxidermy? And I think you can hold whatever opinion you may have about hunting, about any issues related to animals, and still have the sort of moral obligation to learn about something that some people feel is very meaningful and aesthetically pleasing, and I have lots of opinions about lots of things, but my strongest opinion is that I really should learn about as much as I can learn, and that in a weird way, I think it's more important for me to learn about the things that I'm a little uncomfortable with, because I'm curious about challenging my assumptions. And that, I think, becomes where I get excited as a writer, is can I draw people to a subject that they may initially think is disturbing or uncomfortable. And I'm not looking to change their mind. I'm just saying, well, this will be interesting. Let's look at it. Let's learn about it. Let's explore it. Let's see why some people are drawn to it. I'll give you one more sort of example in this way, and then it looks like we've got some questions. But when I wrote for Rolling Stone, I only liked writing about bands that I didn't like and that were very popular, because I thought, all right, I think they're a terrible band, but they're incredibly successful. So what am I missing, or why do some people love this when I think it's horrible? And I didn't really like writing about bands that I loved, but I was really interested in writing about bands that I didn't love. And I think it's sort of the same impulse.
Yeah, I love that. And I have more questions about that, but I want to cede the floor to some of these questions that have come in from the audience. Will Jones says next year marks the 20th anniversary of Adaptation, one of my favorite movies. What are your memories of being involved with that movie, and are there any particular stories on animals that you think would be a good cinematic adaptation? Now that you're
Well, my memories of being involved with adaptation are actually very, I was really reluctant and initially had said that I didn't want them to use my name, or I'd already sold the option to the story, so it was too late to absolutely stop what was going on. But I thought, well, I don't want my name in this. And then at some point I just thought, oh, why not? This will be an experience. But it was so unlike the book that, there was a part of me that just kept thinking, I don't understand what's going on, but I kind of can't resist finding out. And of course, I love the movie. I think it's in many ways truer to the spirit of the book than a really sort of literal adaptation would have been. And I had a blast. The whole time I kept thinking, I have no idea how this is going to turn out. But once I surrendered and thought, all right, I'm in for the long haul. Let's just see where this goes. It was really exciting and, strange and wonderful.
And from this collection was the other part of the question. I'm trying to think what I would nominate for Hollywood here.
Well, actually, the Little Wing, which is a story about this teenage girl who raises racing pigeons, has been optioned. So that is in development. And I think it would make a great movie. You could do a free Willy.
Yeah, that is very
which would be very meta.
Yes. Yeah, call Charlie Kaufman.
Well, you would need somebody who could really put a spin on it, because but the fact is it's an amazing story and it's a crazy story, and in a way far more complex and interesting than the actual Free Willy movie.
Yeah, I noticed you didn't. The story ends before he dies a year. I wondered if
right.
you had any in putting the book together where you at all tempted to go. I guess it's sort of not exactly, it's more of a tragic note, I guess, in the end.
Right. Well, I was really torn, and I had mixed feelings about not doing an afterword. And my editor had asked me to, and I resisted, even though I can see where it would have been actually useful. It was really sad. And I had gone back to Iceland and saw Keiko after I was done working on this piece. I did go back to Iceland and met him and petted him, actually.
Did you write about that?
No, I didn't. And now I'm feeling like, I maybe should have added that in. And who knows? Maybe I'll do it for the paperback.
Then a very nice comment from Richard. Hello, Richard. Thanks for hosting us. Gail Hercules says, how long did you work on this book? How did you know it was finished?
Well, the earliest story in the book, I'll have to flip to the back. These are I think the oldest piece in the book I wrote in 1995. So you could say that in a sense, I've been working on this book since 1995, which, knowing how slow I am, that actually makes sense that I've been working on it since 1995. In the case of a collection, it's very different. I had the idea of collecting the pieces that I'd written about animals. And initially, I wasn't sure if I had enough, and I just pulled together the stories and immediately realized that I had a book's worth of pieces. So it made perfect sense to put them together.
Well, I think unless there are any more Q&As, I have a final question. If we need an outro here. I was wondering if there are any animal stories out there that you've been circling, like your white whale, although that's probably a bad metaphor, especially if you treat white whales pretty meanly in the Keiko chapter. I wondered.
I'm just quoting Melville. Okay. Don't put it on me.
Okay. Oh, gosh, I'm so dense. I didn't even. Well, right, the metaphor. So I wondered if there were other creatures or species or stories out there that you've been thinking about doing, or do you feel like this ends your I can't imagine it ends your animal interest, publishing?
No, it absolutely doesn't end my animal interest. And I had been coincidentally was about to do a story about koi and koi shows, and these, it's a real subculture of people who raise basically giant goldfish, and they're worth untold fortunes. And I was ready to travel to interview this woman who's kind of restoring her family's koi farm, I guess it would be called a farm, in Taiwan, right when COVID occurred. So it was just impossible to travel, but it was certainly an interesting, I still find the subject really, really interesting. My guess is that these stories will keep ambling into my field of vision. I think my antenna tend to wiggle when I hear a story that seems interesting, that involves animals. And there are plenty of species still out there to write about.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation and for writing all of these wonderful pieces over the years. It's a real treasure to have them all here in this book, and a thrill to speak with you tonight.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it so much.
Yeah. So another cheesy metaphor, but it was such a delight to be a fly on the wall for this conversation. And I think I really took for granted what an asset your curiosity is. I think that's such a wonderful way to put it, because you are this wonderful proxy for the reader. You just kind of dive right in. It's not a big deal if you don't know anything, and there we are. And what a gift for me anyway, and I imagine for many of our readers. So, and I've dropped the link in quite a few times, but I just want to remind folks that we have almost a disaster. I can't believe that's never happened before after doing 100 of these. First time for everything. Handsome signed book plate editions of On Animals, and a little guilt trip. We can't do these kinds of events, virtual, hybrid, in person, or whatever else we may come up with as time goes on, without your support. So if you haven't already picked up this beautiful soul palette cleanser of a book, please do it with us. You can order online, over the phone, or just come see us at one of the 4 stores on the square. This really has just been so great. And I mean it when I mean like a soul palate cleanser. It just makes you smile. Even the not so nice parts in the book. It's just really wonderful and makes my job really easy. It's a fun book to hand sell, and I'm so grateful for you writing them and putting them together. And thank you, Nathaniel, for your wonderful questions and moderating our Q&A. And I could just go on and on with this little love fest, but perhaps we should wrap it up. Congratulations on this wonderful book. It's been such a delight to host you both. I hope to do it in person next time. The next book, either of you, we'd love to have you. But in the meantime, take care. Would you like to say anything else, or should we?
Oh, well, I want to thank you again and thank everybody for joining us, and thank you, Nathaniel.
Thank you.
Yes.
Square books.
Bravo. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Y'all take care, and hope to do this again soon. Okay. See ya.